for official ID. We found out that actually developing countries do a better job of applying the rules than do developed countries. Again, a big surprise. We thought perhaps because of lack of capacity that rich countries would do better than poor. In fact, completely the opposite. The OECD countries, despite being the ones that invented rules on corporate transparency, are actually the worst at applying them in practice, we found. One of the worst performers of all was actually the United States, whereas one of the easiest countries in the world to purchase an untraceable or anonymous shell company, and perhaps thus it's no coincidence that Malaysian official number one and people like Obiang have routed much of their illicit wealth through the United States using US shell companies. I'll finish up with just a couple of thoughts about the future. So this is the past research from our Global Shell Games project. And in speaking about this, people said, well, okay, shell companies are important and shell companies are an important part of tackling corruption and a wide variety of other financial crimes. But how about banks? Surely banks are the crux of the issue. And we thought, well, fair enough. We're interested in finding out, just like we're interested in finding out whether corporate service providers apply the rules that, in theory, but do they in practice? So too we're interested in whether banks actually look through these shell companies to find the beneficial owner before opening a bank account. And so unfortunately we can lie to corporate service providers, and that's not a criminal offence. If you lie to a bank in writing, like in an email, that can be bank fraud. So for the experiment, for the project that we have underway, we've actually formed 12 shell companies in different jurisdictions, and they're actually going to do the solicitation for us. We've got a list of every single bank in the world and their contact details. We'll be making contact with them, just like we did with the corporate service providers, to see to what extent in practice, as well as in theory, they apply the rules. And then we're sending a friend around on an all-expenses paid trip around the world to 8 different financial centres where he'll replicate our email shopping experience, except he'll be lucky enough to do it in person. We hope to be able to update you on the results in the next year. It'll be interesting what we find. Thanks very much for your attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, we follow the same procedure that questions will be posed at the end to the 2 winners. And so now I have the pleasure to give you the floor. After the showing of the...
In the fight against corruption, it is vital to begin educating the next generation of citizens as early as possible. This was the aim of Dr. Robtal Nije Polley, Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Oxford, when she wrote her children's books, Bagba and Jade. The books introduce children to the effects of corruption on everyday life and have been made into short films and even songs. Dr. Polley has spoken at a number of prestigious events on the subject of corruption, including a 2016 TED Talk on corruption in Africa, as well as at a number of conferences and seminars across the world. When not furthering the cause of anti-corruption, she also focuses her research and attention on the pressing issues of human migration and gender equality in Africa. Alongside this, with over a decade of combined professional experiences in Africa, Europe, and North America, she has consulted across a broad range of fields while supporting universities, governments, NGOs, media institutions, and regional and multilateral agencies.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, you guys are going to have to do better than that. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, now I know you're awake. So I'd like to thank the Malaysian Institute for Integrity for having me here, for hosting all of us. And I'd also like to thank ROLOG for this amazing and incredible honor. So I've worked in a number of different spheres, as the video showed. I've worked in the media, I've worked for government, I've worked with international and intergovernmental organizations, and I've also worked at academic institutions. And what I've found as being trained as an academic is that we are taught to find the gaps, right? We are taught to figure out what perspectives, who's not being represented in a particular field, and to fill those gaps by looking at what's deliberately silenced or preferably unheard, right? And I realize that I've used this training from these different spheres, but particularly from academia, to look at what are the gaps in the fight against corruption? What are the gaps in the advocacy around integrity that are not being filled? And I've tried to fill these with the 2 anti-corruption children's books that I have written. So what are the 3 gaps that I'm trying to fill? And I think that I have done a pretty successful job, and I intend to do even more with the funding from ROLOG. So the first is, I think, when we have conversations around corruption or integrity, they're often held in adult circles, right? We never really consult children about how corruption actually impacts adversely their lives. So I wanted to find out what would happen if we focused that conversation on children, if we started to have national conversations with children about ethics, about integrity, and about how corruption actually impacts their own existence on this earth. The second gap that I wanted to fill is I think we focus too much on public sector graft. We focus too much on high-level private sector graft. But we rarely ever self-reflexively think about how we're complicit through our own everyday interactions, right? Through our own everyday dubiousness. Because we all are complicit in perpetuating corruption. This is the argument that I make. Through our actions, through the things that we do to bypass systems in order to benefit us. But we don't call that corruption. We always point the finger at the high-level public official or the high-level private sector official. So what I try to do is to talk about corruption in everyday forms, right? The third gap that I try to fill is I think the definition of corruption is too narrow, right? Using entrusted power for private gain. The way that I describe corruption in my books is simply lying, cheating, and stealing, right, for children, for them to be able to digest the material. And then related to that, I think the language around corruption is too high level. If you look at the context of Africa, when we talk about corruption, we use colonial languages to talk about corruptions. We use that word corruption. What I wanted to do was look at corruption from local languages, because for me, language is culture. And there are certain things we can communicate by calling someone a thief in Bassa that we can't communicate by calling somebody corrupt in the English language. So those are the 3 gaps that I hope to achieve, and I've been trying to achieve with these 2 books. So Bagba, I'll tell you a little bit about the 2 books without going into too much detail and selling the story. Bagba is a book that was written in 2013, published by One More Book, which is a small niche publisher based in the United States, founded by 5 Liberian citizens who are all artists in their own right. And the book was also illustrated by a self-taught political cartoonist by the name of Chase Walker, who's also Liberian. The book follows a day in the life of twin characters, Sundema and Sundiga, who leave the port city of Buchanan where they live, and they move to Monrovia to visit their aunt and uncle for a few days. And they have a series of encounters and experiences that remind them of this Bassa word. Bassa is one of the languages spoken in Liberia, meaning corruption. Bagba means corruption effectively or trickery. The second book, Jade, is going to be published in January 2019. And whereas the first book teaches children about what not to do, the second book, Jade, means truthfulness, honesty, accountability in the Bassa language as well. So the children, the twin characters, have a series of encounters or experiences that remind them of this Bassa word, Jade. So what does it mean to be truthful? What does it mean to be accountable, not only to oneself, but also one's community, one's nation, one's continent, and one's world? So why did I write these 2 books? People always say to me, you know, why are you focusing on children? They can't change policy. But that's precisely it, right? In my country, Liberia, we have lots of great regulations. We have lots of great institutions. We have lots of great rules and regulations on the books, but we don't implement, right? So I moved back to Liberia in 2007 as a young idealistic 25-year-old working for the government, and I saw corruption, again, enmeshed in everyday human interactions. I didn't just see it in the government. I saw it in the media circles. I saw it in the churches. I saw it in the mosques. I saw it at the universities. I saw it in the schools. I saw it everywhere. Part of it was a function of the war. During the war, a lot of people had to use very cunning means to be able to survive. But we still got that sort of mentality. In order to get ahead, you have to do so through very, very dubious means. And again, the way that I describe corruption or bagba in the book is simply lying, cheating, and stealing in the everyday human interactions that we have. But there were two real encounters that I remember that really shook my center of gravity and made me think about these issues in much more granular terms. The first was when I moved to Liberia, I realized that our whole bilateral scholarship scheme was completely corrupted, right? People were selling scholarships to the highest bidder. They were giving scholarships to their relatives. And the president of Liberia at the time asked me to reform the process. But in the process of reforming, we realized that a number of students who were applying for these scholarships were forging their national exam records. We invited them in, and these were maybe 15 to 18-year-olds, and they denied forging their exam records. After they finally confessed, I realized that 15 to 18-year-olds were already schooled in the ways of corruption. The second encounter I had was at the University of Liberia where I taught, where I had a conversation with university students about the difference between corruption and contribution. Many of them argued that giving a traffic officer money to bypass traffic was not corruption, it was contribution, because you're contributing to the person's salary, given that they make so little money. So again, they had already rationalized corruption as the norm. It became so normalized that university students and high school students didn't think that there was anything wrong with it. So what I realized is that, again, young adults are already schooled in the ways of corruption. So we really need to build a new generation of integrity advocates and anti-corruption champions at an earlier age, right? Because it's between the ages of 8 and 10 that children really begin to develop an ethical core or a moral compass. This is what child psychology teaches us. I also realized that children can be anti-corruption advocates if we cultivate their inherent integrity, their natural honesty. And I call this a revolution from below, right? It's not a top-down revolution, it's a revolution from below, using children as able-bodied allies in the fight against corruption. So what's my theory of change for Bagba and Jade? Again, I believe fundamentally that children are refreshingly honest until we socialize them to be dishonest. And if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a short story. And we've probably all heard this story in different forms. So there's a mother and a child at home, and they receive a knock at the door. And the mother peeks through the window and realizes that the person at the door is somebody that she actually doesn't want to talk to. So she tells her child, please tell that person at the door that I'm not home. And the child says, okay. The child goes to the door, opens the door, and says, my mother just told me I should tell you that she's not here. I tell this story often because it's a prime example of children just being inherently honest, refreshingly truthful, until we teach them to lie, until we teach them to be dishonest. What I'm trying to do through these two books is to basically reverse that socialization process by equipping children with the verbal tools to question and even resist the corrupt practices that they see their adults in their lives engaging in. And my hope is that this may enable them to embarrass the adults into living more ethical, upright lives, right? In the everyday interactions that they have. So again, the approach is really about changing values, changing practices, and changing norms, not necessarily changing policy, because we have enough of those on the books. What are the methodologies that I employ? Both formal and informal, because as I've mentioned earlier, I think corruption happens in formal settings, but it also happens in informal settings, right? Through unwritten rules, regulations that we have and that we don't necessarily verbalize. I also do a lot of collaborations because I think we cannot win this fight against corruption if we do it in silos. We must go across divides. We must have private and public sector sort of collaborations. So what I've done is used a local language, Bassa, to have a conversation about what this means. There is a Kenyan writer by the name of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, maybe some of you are familiar with him, and he argues that he writes only in his native Gikuyu language. And he argues that when African writers write in colonial languages, what you're effectively doing is you're placing your ideas, the ethos of what you're thinking, into a linguistic prison. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to take the language around corruption out of its linguistic prison in Liberia and use local languages. Because the force of this word bagba means much more in Liberia if you say it than if you say corruption. The force of the word jade means much more in Liberia if you use it than if you say honesty or integrity. The other thing that we've done is we've developed multimedia tools co-developed with artists, local artists in Liberia. So we have a song and a music video that was produced by Takunje. The song of the sequel, my younger sister, who's a vocalist in the audience, has sung on the song. We've created a 5-minute radio drama with Flomo Theater, a stage play with Flomo Theater that features an all-child cast, and also a multimedia website, because the idea is to expand the reach of the book beyond the written text and to enable people to have different access to it, because we know that not everybody is going to have access to the written text, but they might listen to the radio drama. They might watch the song or the video. And again, meeting people with the message where they are. All of these multimedia tools were funded by the Open Society Initiative for West Africa, and I'm truly grateful for that support. The other thing is looking at formal adoption of the book into the school curriculum. I have partnered with the Ministry of Education in Liberia, as well as the Ghana Education Service in Ghana, to place the book on supplemental reader lists for 3rd to 5th graders in Liberia and for primary 3 in Ghana. We've also piloted the book in 2 regions in Liberia, 30 schools. We have worked with the curriculum team at the University of Liberia as well as the Ministry of Education in Liberia to develop a teacher's guide so that teachers have a sort of guide for how they use the book with a series of different activities that they can use in companion with the book. And then I've also conducted Bagba workshops not only in Liberia but across the continent and the Caribbean as well as the UK. So I've done Bagba workshops in Cote d'Ivoire, in Jamaica, in Liberia, in Mozambique, and the UK. And the idea is to have dialogues with children about why does corruption happen, and then what can actually be done about it. Because children are interesting in that they already have the solutions. We just need to listen to them. So what are some of the future interventions that I hope to achieve with the ACE Award? The first is taking the all-child cast stage play on the road to schools, to churches, to mosques, to town halls and to ministries, and having something called Forum Theater, where after the theater production, the audience asks the children questions about their character, and they're required to respond in character. And there was one instance where we debuted the all-child stage play in Monrovia, where a young girl from a school in Monrovia in the audience stood up and asked the police officer, the young kid who was about 8 years old, about why he engages in corruption. And she asked, well, police officer, what do we need to do as a society to ensure that you don't take a bribe? And the young person's response was, increase my salary. This young boy already understood that. He already understood that corruption is not just a function of greed, but it's also a function of poverty. There are actual people in society who make so little, and that's not to condone their behavior, but there are reasons why people do what they do, right? It's understanding the psyche around corruption. The other intention is to expand the books to pilots within Liberia in 3 of the largest populated counties, so Nimba, Lofa, and Bong, introducing them to schools across those 3 counties. Also pilots in other countries across the continent. I think of this as a Pan-African movement. It goes beyond the continent of Africa, but I'm starting with the continent because it's where I find myself and that's where my context is. So we're going to Ghana, we're going to Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya, and we're going to work in collaboration with the Ministries of Education as well as anti-corruption agencies. There's also been a lot of interest in translating the book into African local languages as well as European official languages. So I've been approached by Hausa speakers, by Swahili speakers, by Malagasy speakers, by French speakers and Arabic speakers to translate the book. And then last but certainly not least is adapting the book into also other multimedia tools. So the board game, somebody has said that they want to develop a Bagba and Jade board game. An animator has said that he wants to develop the book into a TV animation. In closing, what I would like to argue is that I think children have much more to teach us about honesty. Children have much more to teach us about integrity than we think that they do. And all we have to do is really listen to those messages. And what I intend to do with the books further is to really give children the verbal tools to teach us and remind us about what it means to be inherently and naturally honest. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dear friends and colleagues, now the floor is yours. Any question? I think that we heard really two completely different subjects matter from two excellent university professors who really gave us a lesson on how to present their ideas, their studies, their research. I was absolutely impressed. I don't think that I saw your book when we were considering you, but we managed to find a video. Okay. And really, not only myself, but also all my colleagues were absolutely impressed by it. And of course, I have been reading already for quite some time the studies and the research of Sherman, and I think that my good friend Mohammed has already stressed the importance of research for policy development. And no doubt what the research of Sherman is demonstrating is that something that can be extremely useful to not only implement more effectively some of the provisions of financial task force or the provision of UNCAC or whatever other existing law and regulations may be at the national level, but also shows that we should probably try to reply with the same inventive and imagination and methodology to all that corrupt people and in general transnational organized criminality is doing in order to have a more effective reaction. I will stop here. The floor is yours. Francois.
So, Francois Amélie from the Sorbonne University, and my question goes to James Sharman. I think when we spoke together, you also insisted a little bit on the fact that what you're doing is not only to attract everybody's attention on shell companies, but also it will, of course, facilitate the fact of getting back the money, because you're insisting on the fact that the problem today for asset recovery in these cases is just, it's so hard to go through all these different shell companies. Can you please elaborate a little bit also on this aspect?
Let's have, if there are any more questions from the floor? Yes, please.
Anis Yusuf. First, let me congratulate both. I think the excellent story that you have shared with us. For the professor, we very much thought that another area of research, perhaps you have something to share with us, is to look at the underground economy. I mean, how do you think this relates in terms of, because we know there's a lot of money there, and that money is being used to pay for corruption. How can we do it properly in terms of from research work, where this will need to be exposed, and I think that would be a good learning from the other side. For you, Madam, I hope you have a chance to look at this institute a couple of years ago started a special module for kindergarten. Perhaps some of the work here that you can look and take back home, but also we would like perhaps to translate those two books that you have to Malay language that we can use here in Malaysia. Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay. Sherman.
I have another question to the professor, sorry. My name is Azman from Malaysia Airports. Prof, quick question. It's about KYC, know your client. So how do you strike a balance? I think from the academic, there are certain laws, probably regulations in the industry itself. How far do you go to ensure that you know your clients and then you dive in and extract those kind of information? What's the fine line there?
Any more questions?
A very simple question.
Sorry, very quick, very short question because we are under very strict time limitation. Please.
Okay, how come intelligent people, very super intelligent with PhD professor are involved in corruption? What make they become a corrupted people? Number one. Number two, question number two, in Malaysia, once upon a time, about 2 months ago or 1 month back, the commissioner of Malaysian corruption have told everyone else in Malaysia that there is a corruption happening in Malaysia. The children, the school children is now involved in corruption. But unfortunately, it's been received in a negative way by some NGOs, companies say, you cannot say that. You are like, discriminating the educationists who have been trying to teach all the children at a very low level. So it's wrong for you to say that, even though it happened in Malaysia. What do you think of this kind of people? Thank you very much.
Okay, no more questions. You have the floor.
Okay, lots of questions, lots of very good questions, not much time for answers, so I'll be brief. I was at a presentation by a US government law enforcement official who said he couldn't believe such a nerdy subject as beneficial ownership in shell companies was getting attention, which hurt my feelings a bit, but never mind. Certainly I think that, one of the most important reasons that we need corporate transparency is not only to find the wrongdoers, but find their money and bring it back. And again, Nuhu Ribadu has been one of the leaders of this in Nigeria, and of course there's the very complicated and serious case currently going on in Malaysia now. So I think that basically, unless we can ensure the transparency of shell companies, we can pretty much kiss goodbye to the prospect of asset recovery, that is repatriating the illicit gains of those, running into the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that have gone through. So I think, it's absolutely a prerequisite for successful asset recovery. In terms of the underground economy, I think there it may well be that banks are more important. The underground economy can be a much broader term, can take into account things that are not necessarily illegal, they just may be off the books, like cash-in-hand payments or so on. And there I'm hoping that our second project, which I spoke briefly about at the end with banks, may shed some light. Again, it builds on the same sort of skepticism that Robtel talked about, that you can have all the rules and laws you want, but if they're not enforced, it doesn't really do much good. And lastly, again, very briefly, a complicated question about know your customer. I think you've got to license the entities that actually create shell companies and make sure they get in big trouble if they're not doing what they should. Which sounds very simple, but surprisingly, in places like my own country, Australia, which has very little interest in combating international corruption, but also the United States, that those who form shell companies are entirely unregulated, and correspondingly they don't take transparency requirements very seriously.
Thank you.
Sure. With the invitation of translating into Malay, I would love to. That's a conversation we can have, and I'd be happy to look at the material that you produce for kindergarten kids. I think one of the things that we have to remember is context matters when we're having conversations around corruption, that you can't do a copy and paste, one-size-fits-all approach is, I think, not the right approach to take. But I do think that we can learn a lot from each other, and I think this book, again, I started it out as sort of a book specifically for Liberian kids, but it's now become this sort of Pan-African initiative where people from across the continent are asking me to come and introduce it into their school systems and to translate it so that children across the continent also understand what's happening in Liberia as well. I wasn't sure I completely understood the second question, but I guess my response generically would be that children, I think they're inherently honest, but I think they also model behavior. I think corruption, just as much as integrity, is modeled behavior. So what I'm trying to do is to really make adults uncomfortable with giving children the verbal tools to question and resist corruption. I'll give you a prime example. So there is a part of the stage play, one of the young girls who participated in the stage play is about 8 years old. And after the stage play debuted in Monrovia, her mother came to me and said, honestly, Robtel, I love you, but I also hate you at the same time. And I said, well, why is that? She said, because what you've effectively done is you've created an anti-corruption police officer in my home, an integrity advocate in my home who constantly questions every single thing that I do. But it's not only made me a better parent, it's also made me a better citizen. So I thank you for being, for doing what you're doing. And this book is really revolutionizing how parents interact with their children.
Okay, I think that before we conclude this session with an applause, I think that I should like to say that Sherman mainly spoke about one piece of his research, which are the shell company, because of the importance in connection with corruption. But I think that he has published extensively also in related fields, starting from grand corruption to money laundering, and particularly also the nexus between corruption, transnational organized crime, terrorism, etc. I would like to have placed another question, but we can discuss later between the two of us about this nexus and what would be the thing in terms of criminal policy in general in order to look at this phenomenon from a wider point of view. And as far as the book is concerned, the educational book, I think that is fantastic. It's beautiful. I am glad that you have received so many requests for the distribution and publication in other language. Already the Center for Anti-Corruption and Rule of Law is ready for the Arabic. You have La Sorbonne in France with our professor Francois, who expressed interest. I don't know whether there are questions with the publisher or whatever. I have no idea of all these things. However, it's a good start in order to have more distribution. And with this, I would like to conclude this session and to start right away. There is no coffee break with the last session. So I will ask, I will ask you to go back to your seat.
Thank you, Professor Jason Sharman and Dr. Optal, Nigel Polley.
And of course, I will have to ask the last panelist to join me here while the movies about their presentation is going to be shown.
The Papua New Guinea Phones Against Corruption initiative is an innovative approach to reporting corruption using the text message system on mobile phones. The SMS system involves close collaboration with government entities, the private sector, media and donors, and it allows citizens to report corruption in a way that is both anonymous and free of charge. The initiative has received over 6,000 messages, almost 38 a day. Of these reports, over 250 cases are being investigated by the Papua New Guinea authorities, with 5 awaiting trial. The initiative is responsible for the arrest of 2 Papua New Guinea government bureaucrats for mismanagement of over $2 million of official funds. According to the OEDC, the beauty of Phones Against Corruption is its simplicity. It is not a mobile app that requires a data connection or a smartphone. It is an SMS interactive system, free of charge for users, 100% anonymous, used in simple mobile phones, requiring no internet. It is an inclusive tool that is accessible by those in the city, but also by those in rural areas, where people are often more exposed to the risks of corruption.
The importance of innovation. You have the floor. Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon. I think I need to introduce myself because unlike the others, our names are not put on. So I'm Appala Saripalli and I have my colleague Sam Irappan working in the Department of Finance. I work for UNDP PNG. I consult on this program. This is a program which is called the Phones Against Corruption program, which is an innovative program that's designed by Department of Finance with help and assistance from UNDP and Australian DFAT. It was designed in 2014. I have the presentation outline here. First, I would like to thank ROLEC for giving this award to a government-run program for the first time, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Because all the other people have been private sector organizations or private sector individuals, and this is the first one that comes from a government. And that shows that problem of corruption, governments are equally interested in fighting corruption. It's not just private sector individuals who are perceived to be crusaders for fighting corruption, and governments are always the instigators or perpetrators of corruption. Because corruption ultimately affects votes, and if you want to be re-elected, you need efficient governments to fight corruption. So that's the most important thing that I wanted to mention. So that's the presentation outline. We have the context. Another thing is, the problem with corruption is, it's a universal problem, but the methods to fight corruption will be contextual. What works in one country will not work in another country. That's one of the reasons why we decided to keep this program as anonymous, because if you look at PNG's context, you will see that it's a small Pacific Ocean island state, and 8 million people with 600 islands, 800 tribes, 1,000 languages. It says about a challenging geography on the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's classified as low middle income and resource rich, and that puts donors at a distance from us. And dispersed cultural ethnicity, which is a big challenge because of the tribal Wantok culture system. Nobody wants to report one of their own. That's why we had to make this program anonymous. And it has championed decentralization to deliver services, and global warming and natural disasters also affect PNG a lot, and it has significant infrastructure constraints and also human development problems. And administration and governance challenges is also a big problem. That's why government of PNG recognizes corruption as a big challenge. Despite all its challenges, it has upheld democracy with commitment to remain open and accountable. Throughout history of Papua New Guinea's freedom, there has been only one instance where there was a short break in democratic form of governance. That's probably for a day. And the normal perception is that countries that are corrupt are dangerous, but the reverse is true. All dangerous countries are highly corrupt, but all corrupt countries are not highly dangerous. So in that sense, PNG has got a wrong notion around the world, and I want to dispel that here today. I just wanted to show you this slide because this program started in 2014. And if you see there, in 2015, we held the Pacific Games. In 2016, we held the FIFA Under-20 Women's World Soccer. In November 2018, we held the APEC Diplomatic Summit. Now, this is not possible if the country is dangerous. Yes, agreed, we have problems. Corruption is a universal problem. It's not only a PNG problem. If my annual budget is about $4 billion, there is a report which says that Pentagon cannot equate vouchers worth $6 trillion between the two wars. I need to spend my entire budget for 1,500 years to reach that level. So who is more corrupt? That's a question. What we believe is we can do better that if we can minimize corruption, and this program tries to do that. So these are all the host of initiatives, good governance initiatives that PNG government has been implementing, and Phones Against Corruption is just one of those. You need a host of initiatives. Corruption is just one dimension that determines the quality of delivery of services to people. But you need good governance, you need management, you need a host of initiatives to combine with fight against corruption to deliver those services to the people. So we are running short of time, so I'm not going to elaborate all those good governance initiatives. They're listed there. You have the presentations available for you. I'm just going to rush through the Phones Against Corruption one. The Phones Against Corruption program is an innovative program which takes social accountability, citizen participatory approach to fight corruption. We bank on texts coming to the program, so that means citizens are our biggest partners. So it's basically, like it was shown in the video, it's an interactive text message system. We had to go to the text message platform because in 2014, there was virtually very little internet connectivity, and even if it was there, in the urban centers, the bandwidth was low, so we couldn't go for a smartphone thing. So it asks for 7 key texts. One is 16321, which is the number which you text. And then it asks you for language, which language you want to report in. We want it to be inclusive, give a choice to the people to report in English or to Pidgin. So you type E for English or P for Pidgin, and then it asks you 3 quick questions: where, when, and whether the transaction is financial, the corruption that is involved is financial or non-financial. The reason behind putting this one is all corrupt transactions are not necessarily financial. There are non-financial aspects to it. So when we get the non-financial text, we partner with the Ombudsman Commission and hand them over those texts so that they can investigate them. Being Department of Finance, we only are interested in investigating the financial aspects of corruption. And even then, our liability ends once we have gathered the evidence and passed it on to the police. Because we don't have the investigative prosecution powers are with the judiciary and investigation powers are with the police. So our job is to gather the evidence and pass it on, so in a way to minimize corruption. Then it asks you what, and finally it gives you a thank you message. It's not a mobile app, it's just an SMS system, does not require internet connection, is free of charge to the users. We kept this free of charge because we want people not to pay for it, and we pay for it in advance in SMS bundles. We buy 50,000 or 100,000 bundles, and we pay for it in advance. It is anonymous. This anonymity is maintained. We have a communication partner, and we have a technology partner. When you send a text as a citizen to report abuse of power or corruption, it goes to the communication partner. The communication partner hosts all the texts on his website. The technology partner draws them down and deletes the phone number and puts a case ID number and hosts it back on his site.